The New York City courthouse buzzed with nervous energy as spectators, lawyers, and jurors filed into the crowded room. Judge Olivia Washington, an African-American woman known for her sharp intellect and unwavering integrity, strode confidently to her bench. Her presence commanded respect. Yet defense attorney Richard Hawkins seemed determined to ignore her, his attention fixated on his client. As Judge Washington called the court to order, Hawkins' demeanor shifted from indifference to thinly veiled disdain. His opening statement was peppered with subtle jabs at the judge's competence, each word dripping with condescension. The courtroom tensed, aware of the undercurrent of disrespect. Judge Washington, her voice steady and authoritative, addressed the court. "Mr. Hawkins, I remind you that in this courtroom, we adhere to a standard of professionalism and respect. Your experience, while noteworthy, does not exempt you from these expectations." Hawkins bristled visibly, his face flushing with indignation. He opened his mouth to retort, but Judge Washington continued, her gaze unwavering. "We are here to serve justice, counselor. I suggest we focus on the case at hand, rather than personal grievances." The gallery murmured in approval, and even some jurors nodded imperceptibly. Hawkins, momentarily chastened, adjusted his tie and grudgingly complied. As the proceedings began in earnest, it was clear that this trial would be about more than just the case on the docket. It would be a test of character, a confrontation of deep-seated prejudices, and potentially a catalyst for change in the hearts and minds of all present. As the trial progressed, Judge Washington masterfully guided the presentation of evidence. Her questions were incisive, cutting through attempts at obfuscation and bringing clarity to complex issues. She introduced statistical data and expert testimony that shed light on systemic discrimination within the justice system. Hawkins, growing increasingly agitated, struggled to maintain his composure. His cross-examinations became more aggressive, his objections more frequent and less founded. Judge Washington calmly overruled him when necessary, her decisions backed by solid legal reasoning that even Hawkins couldn't refute. In the gallery, a young attorney named Ethan Rodriguez watched the proceedings with rapt attention. Fresh out of law school, he had idolized Hawkins, seeing him as the epitome of legal success. Now, as he observed the interplay between the seasoned lawyer and the poised judge, Ethan found his perspective shifting. During a particularly heated exchange, Hawkins lost his cool. "With all due respect, Your Honor," he spat, the honorific sounding more like an insult. "Perhaps in your unique position, you're unable to see the facts objectively." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Judge Washington's eyes narrowed, but her voice remained level. "Mr. Hawkins, I'll remind you that my unique position includes over 2 decades of legal experience and an oath to uphold justice for all. Your insinuation is not only inappropriate, but borders on contempt of court." Ethan felt a mixture of shame and admiration wash over him. He had never seen Hawkins so thoroughly put in his place, and he couldn't help but be impressed by Judge Washington's unwavering professionalism in the face of such blatant disrespect. As the day's session came to a close, Ethan found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about what it meant to be a great lawyer. He realized that true legal excellence wasn't about winning at all costs, but about pursuing justice with integrity and respect for all. The following day, Judge Washington addressed the jury with a compassionate yet firm demeanor. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying a note of gravitas, "as we continue this trial, I ask you to reflect on your own experiences with discrimination, whether personally faced or witnessed. Our justice system relies on your ability to view the facts impartially, but also to understand the human element in every case." Her words resonated through the courtroom, prompting silent nods and thoughtful expressions. Even Hawkins seemed momentarily subdued, a flicker of something, perhaps recognition, crossing his face. Suddenly, a voice rang out from the back of the courtroom. "Your Honor, if I may." All heads turned to see Amanda Chen, a court clerk, standing with determination etched on her face. Judge Washington, after a moment's consideration, nodded for her to continue. Amanda's voice trembled slightly as she began. I've worked in this courthouse for 5 years, and I've seen countless cases, but I've also experienced firsthand the sting of prejudice. She recounted an incident where she was mistaken for a defendant rather than a court employee, describing the hurt and frustration she felt. As Amanda spoke, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted palpably. Jurors leaned forward, their expressions a mix of sympathy and dawning realization. Even some of Hawkins' colleagues exchanged uncomfortable glances. Ethan, still grappling with his conflicting emotions, felt a surge of admiration for Amanda's courage. He glanced at Hawkins, expecting to see the familiar mask of detached professionalism. Instead, he was surprised to find his mentor's brow furrowed, a hint of discomfort in his usually confident posture. Judge Washington thanked Amanda for her bravery, using the moment to underscore the importance of recognizing and addressing unconscious biases. As the trial resumed, there was a newfound sense of gravity in the proceedings. The case was no longer just about legal arguments. It had become a mirror, reflecting the deeper issues of equality and justice that permeated society. The courtroom crackled with tension as Hawkins attempted to discredit Judge Washington's witnesses. His tactics grew increasingly desperate, resorting to personal attacks and irrelevant details. But Judge Washington remained unflappable, deftly steering the proceedings back to the facts at hand. "Objection, Your Honor!" Hawkins practically shouted, his face flushed. "This witness's testimony is clearly biased and should be stricken from the record." Judge Washington fixed him with a steady gaze. "Mr. Hawkins, the witness's personal experiences are relevant to this case. Your objection is overruled. Please continue. Ms. Taylor." The witness, Samantha Taylor, a middle-aged African-American woman, took a deep breath before continuing. "As I was saying, I was passed over for promotion 5 times, despite having the highest performance ratings in my department. Each time, the position went to a less qualified white colleague." Her testimony painted a vivid picture of workplace discrimination that left many in the courtroom visibly moved. Jurors scribbled notes furiously, their expressions a mix of concern and dawning realization. Hawkins, sensing the shift in the room, changed tactics. In his closing argument, he appealed to the jury's emotions, painting his client as a victim of circumstance, but his words rang hollow in the wake of the powerful testimonies they had heard. As the jury filed out to deliberate, Ethan caught Hawkins' eye. For the first time, he saw uncertainty in his mentor's face. The once unshakable attorney seemed diminished, the weight of the trial's revelations finally beginning to crack his armor of prejudice. Judge Washington's closing remarks resonated through the courtroom. "As you consider the evidence presented, I urge you to look beyond the surface. Justice is not just about laws on paper, but about recognizing the humanity in each individual who comes before this court." Her words hung in the air, a challenge and a call to action that none present could ignore. As the courtroom emptied, the impact of the day's events lingered, promising that regardless of the verdict, something fundamental had shifted in the hearts and minds of all who had witnessed this extraordinary trial. During a recess, Ethan found himself alone with Judge Washington in a quiet corridor of the courthouse. Gathering his courage, he approached her. "Your Honor, I just wanted to say how much I admire the way you've handled this trial. It's been eye-opening." Judge Washington smiled warmly. "Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. It's not always easy, but it's necessary. Have you considered how you might use your position to promote equality in your own practice?" Ethan hesitated, then confessed, "Honestly, I'm not sure where to start. I've always looked up to Mr. Hawkins. But now, growth often begins with discomfort," Judge Washington said gently. "Let me share something with you." She recounted her own journey, the barriers she faced as a woman of color in the legal profession, and the mentors who helped her along the way. "There were times I wanted to give up," she admitted. "But I realized that my presence in the courtroom was itself an act of resistance against the systemic biases we face." As they talked, Ethan felt a newfound sense of purpose igniting within him. He began to see how he could use his privilege and position to effect real change in the legal system. Meanwhile, back in the courtroom, Hawkins sat alone, lost in thought. The confidence that had bordered on arrogance throughout his career now seemed to waver. He replayed the events of the trial in his mind, seeing his own actions through a new lens. When the court reconvened, there was a subtle shift in Hawkins' demeanor. His arguments, while still zealous in defense of his client, lacked the dismissive tone he had previously employed. He even acknowledged some of the points raised by the prosecution, a move that surprised many in attendance. Judge Washington noticed the change but maintained her professional composure. She knew that true transformation was a journey, and Hawkins had only taken the first tentative steps. As she guided the proceedings, she held on to hope that this trial might be a turning point, not just for the case at hand, but for all those involved in it. As the trial progressed, Judge Washington's influence began to extend beyond the confines of the courtroom. During breaks, jurors could be overheard discussing their own experiences with discrimination, many for the first time. The courthouse cafeteria buzzed with conversations about implicit bias and systemic inequalities. Amanda Chen, emboldened by her earlier statement, began organizing informal gatherings for courthouse staff to share their stories and discuss ways to promote inclusivity within the justice system. Ethan Rodriguez, inspired by his conversation with Judge Washington, joined these meetings, eager to learn and contribute. Even the usually stoic bailiff, Mike Thompson, found himself affected by the changing atmosphere. During a lull in the proceedings, he approached Judge Washington. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "I've been thinking about some things I've seen over the years, things I should have spoken up about." "I'd like to do better," Judge Washington nodded encouragingly. "Awareness is the first step, Mr. Thompson. I'm glad you're taking it." Meanwhile, Richard Hawkins observed these changes with a mixture of discomfort and curiosity. He overheard snippets of conversations that challenged his long-held beliefs. Watching Ethan engage enthusiastically with diverse groups of colleagues, Hawkins felt a twinge of something unfamiliar. Regret, perhaps, or a longing for the idealism he'd long since abandoned. As the trial reconvened, the energy in the courtroom had shifted noticeably. The adversarial tension had given way to a collective sense of purpose. Even as Hawkins continued to advocate for his client, there was a new thoughtfulness to his arguments, a willingness to acknowledge the complexity of the issues at hand. Judge Washington, from her vantage point on the bench, watched this transformation unfold. She knew that true change was rarely swift or easy, but the seeds of progress were undeniably taking root. As she called the court to order, she allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism for the future of justice in her courtroom and beyond. As the trial entered its final stages, Judge Washington seized the opportunity to address broader issues of equity within the legal system. She introduced expert testimony on implicit bias in jury selection and sentencing disparities, challenging everyone present to confront uncomfortable truths. "The law is not just a set of rules," she reminded the court, "but a living, evolving framework for justice. It's our responsibility to ensure it serves all members of our society equally." Her words resonated deeply with Samantha Taylor, who had testified earlier. Inspired by the judge's leadership, Samantha approached the prosecution team during a recess. "I want to do more," she said firmly. "How can I help others who faced similar discrimination?" The lead prosecutor, Jessica Morales, smiled warmly. "Your courage in testifying has already made a difference. But if you're willing, we have a support group for workplace discrimination survivors. Your experience could help others find their voice." Across the aisle, Hawkins listened to this exchange, his expression unreadable. Later, as he prepared his closing arguments, he found himself wrestling with conflicting emotions. The certainty that had defined his career now felt like shifting sand beneath his feet. Ethan, noticing his mentor's distress, cautiously approached. "Mr. Hawkins, is everything all right?" Hawkins looked up, his eyes clouded with doubt. "I've spent my career believing I was upholding the law," he said softly. "But what if I've been part of the problem all along?" Ethan, surprised by this vulnerability, chose his words carefully, recognizing that is a crucial step. "Maybe now you can be part of the solution." As Hawkins nodded slowly, Judge Washington's voice rang out, calling the court back into session. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, everyone sensing that this trial had become about much more than a single case. It was a referendum on the very nature of justice itself. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Washington invited final statements. The gravity of the moment weighed heavily on everyone present, each person acutely aware that they were witnessing a pivotal moment in their collective journey toward justice. Jessica Morales rose first, her voice steady and passionate. Your Honor, members of the jury, throughout this trial, we've seen the face of discrimination laid bare, but we've also seen the power of courage, empathy, and change. The plaintiff's experiences are not isolated incidents, but symptoms of a deeper societal illness. Today, we have the opportunity to take a stand, to say unequivocally that discrimination has no place in our workplaces, our legal system, or our society. As Jessica concluded, several jurors nodded, visibly moved. Judge Washington then turned to Hawkins. Mr. Hawkins, your closing statement? Hawkins stood slowly, the weight of internal conflict evident in his demeanor. He took a deep breath, then began speaking in a voice unlike any he'd used before in court, humble, reflective, and sincere. Your Honor, members of the jury, I've practiced law for over 3 decades, but about my own biases and the role I've played in perpetuating injustice. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Ethan leaned forward, scarcely believing what he was hearing. Hawkins continued, his voice gaining strength. While I still believe in zealously defending my client, I cannot in good conscience ignore the broader issues this case has brought to light. The evidence of systemic discrimination is compelling and demands action from all of us in the legal profession. As Hawkins concluded, the courtroom erupted in a mix of reactions, surprise, respect, and for some, a glimmer of hope. Judge Washington, her expression neutral, but her eyes shining with unexpected emotion, thanked both attorneys for their statements. In that moment, as the jury filed out to begin deliberations, there was a palpable sense that regardless of the verdict, a profound change had already taken place in that courtroom, a change that would ripple out into the world beyond. As the jury deliberated, the tension in the courthouse was palpable. Groups huddled in corners, discussing the trial's unexpected turns. Ethan found himself in conversation with Amanda and several other young lawyers, all of them processing the events they'd witnessed. I never thought I'd see Hawkins admit to being wrong about anything, one of them marveled. Amanda nodded. It just goes to show, change is possible if we're willing to open our eyes and listen. Meanwhile, in a quiet corridor, Hawkins paced nervously. For the first time in his career, he found himself hoping for a verdict that might go against his client, a thought that both terrified and exhilarated him. He was so lost in thought that he almost collided with Judge Washington as she rounded the corner. Mr. Hawkins, she said, her tone neutral but her eyes kind. What if that was quite a closing statement? Hawkins met her gaze, his usual bravado replaced by genuine humility. Your Honor, I owe you an apology. My behavior throughout this trial, and frankly, throughout my career, has been transformative, Judge Washington finished for him. For all of us, the question is, where do we go from here? Before Hawkins could respond, a court officer approached, announcing that the jury had reached a verdict. As they re-entered the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Judge Washington took her place at the bench, her presence as commanding as ever. Has the jury reached a verdict? She asked, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. The four-person stood, clutching a piece of paper that held not just the fate of this case, but potentially the direction of countless future legal battles. We have, Your Honor, she said, her voice trembling slightly with the weight of the moment. As the verdict was read, a collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. But more powerful than the decision itself was the sense that everyone present, from the seasoned judge to the young idealistic lawyers, from the once prejudiced attorney to the courageous witnesses, had been part of something momentous, a turning point in the long arc of justice. In the days following the trial, the impact of Judge Olivia Washington's courtroom reverberated through the legal community and beyond. News outlets picked up the story, not just for the verdict, but for the remarkable transformation that had taken place during the proceedings. Ethan Rodriguez, inspired by the events he'd witnessed, threw himself into pro bono work, focusing on cases of workplace discrimination. He often found himself recalling Judge Washington's words, using them as a guiding light in his budding career. Amanda Chen's informal gatherings evolved into an official diversity and inclusion committee within the courthouse. She worked tirelessly to implement training programs and create safe spaces for dialogue among staff at all levels. Perhaps the most surprising development came from Richard Hawkins. The once formidable attorney announced his intention to take a sabbatical from his high-powered firm. "I need time to reflect and realign my practice with the true principles of justice," he told a stunned press conference. Samantha Taylor, bolstered by her experience in court, became an outspoken advocate for workplace equality. She partnered with Jessica Morales to develop a mentorship program for young professionals facing discrimination. On a warm afternoon several months later, Judge Washington sat in her chambers, reviewing the changes that had swept through her courthouse. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Ethan, Amanda, and to her surprise, Hawkins. "Your Honor," Ethan began, a mix of excitement and nervousness in his voice. "We have a proposal we'd like to discuss with you." As they laid out their plan for a comprehensive justice reform initiative, Judge Washington felt a surge of pride and hope. The trial that had begun in an atmosphere of tension and prejudice had blossomed into a movement for genuine change. "This is just the beginning," she told them, her eyes shining with determination. "But together, I believe we can build a justice system that truly serves all people, regardless of their background or circumstances." As they left her office, energized and united in purpose, Judge Washington turned to gaze out her window at the city beyond. She knew the path ahead would be challenging, filled with obstacles and setbacks. But for the first time in her long career, she felt the full weight of possibility. The possibility of a legal system transformed by empathy, courage, and an unwavering commitment to true justice for all.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.